Hello and welcome to this first video in the series for how to paint Nagash for the Golden Demon. In this video we're going to be looking at the head and more specifically how to paint the non-metallic metal areas on the head. So I'm showing you the paints now. This is something that I used to do in previous videos and then I got out of the habit and just gave you the description below. They're still going to be in the description below, but this makes it much easier for me as well, so I can remember exactly which paints I used. But as you may have noticed, the colours I'm going to be using for the non-metallics there are a little bit different to what you might normally expect. Just before we get into that as well, you might notice on this the head on this Nagash, it's a little bit different from the standard model. So what I've done is I've cut off the bone beard thing that he has and also sculpted on some hair using green stuff. It's quite simple sculpting really. I'm not an amazing sculptor or anything, but I just want to add a bit of movement into the model, especially because, as you'll see when it comes to showing you the rest of the model, I've cut off a lot of the detail with all like the ghosts moving around them and things like that. But anyway, just to get into the painting now. So I'm starting off with English uniform. So you can see the paints there on the wet palette on the top left. Top right is English uniform. Going towards the left from there, golden olive, yellow green, then below that we have Rhinox hide on the right, ice yellow and ivory. So the majority of these are Vallejo paints with just the one Games Workshop, which is Rhinox hide. And all I'm doing for a start is just blocking in using the English uniform where I want the main highlights to go. So as is quite often with my preferences for positioning the primary light source, I'm going for kind of a top left sort of look. So the main highlight there is just above the face. The face obviously I want to be a focal point. It's a little bit tricky with Nagash because there's not a well, with most models they have like a flesh face. With Nagash he's obviously got a very bony face, but the problem with that is that there's not a lot of surface area. There's quite deep shadows and things, so it's hard to make it stand out as a large area of bright light. But well, you'll see that in the future videos how I tackle that. So as I said, just at the moment I'm just blocking in very roughly all these light points, focusing to the left just above his eye socket there. And again, I've only used the English uniform at this stage. Now you might also note that I'm not making the colour really opaque. I don't want a very smooth finish or anything like that. As I add more and more layers, it'll become smooth naturally anyway. But I do want a small amount of texture to be shown. Because this is a Golden Demon piece, I want the texture to be really fine and refined. So normally, if you wanted to paint text and things, you can probably go a little bit more crazy. But the thing with Golden Demon is they do want a really neat finish, and that means that you just have to spend a lot of time that maybe normally you wouldn't care about, but you really have to spend that time to make everything look really neat. So even if you're putting in rough textures and things, they have to be refined afterwards. Now here I'm using the golden olive, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about the colours that I'm using, because always people ask me what colour, what my recipe is for painting a non-metallic, whatever thing I've painted that's non-metallic, and I keep trying to explain to people the colours themselves don't matter too much. Like I just picked these colours out. I was like, when I was looking at Nagash, I was trying to come up with a theme for the whole model, and I wanted Nagash to be really dark and moody, and I was looking at all the artwork for him, and then a lot of the artwork there's this really strong green atmosphere everywhere. Now I've picked the greens more for my preference slightly, so it's not quite the same as the greens that they use in the artwork, but it's still heading towards that way. And that's the reason why I've got greens for the non-metallics. So even though they're not like the standard gold that you would get, kind of like say English uniform, Japanese uniform, ice yellow, So although it has 2 of those colours in there, it's still going to be quite heavily green, and also there's going to be some more green added to it after this to really punch that green through. But the point being that you can still make it look like a shiny kind of gold colour, even though it's green. So I've not followed any other recipes or whatever. I've just picked these colours because I like them, and they follow a good tonal steps going from light to dark. That's all you need for a non-metallic. You can make metallics from any colours you want as long as you have that tonal range, and then you would just work with the volumes. So you can see here, I've just been going over using the layers, going step by step from the darker colour. So you obviously notice I didn't start with the Rhinox hide, which is the darkest colour. The Rhinox hide is there purely as a rubber. So every time I get a bit excessive with some of the marks that I make, I can then go back with the Rhinox hide and dull them down. Rhinox hide is really nice for that kind of thing. It's not amazing coverage, but it does have, it's a dark colour, so it kind of works a little bit for coverage, but it also has a nice translucency. But what that means is it does soft coverage, so you can, if I've made a mistake or something that's a bit heavy, I can tone it down without completely wiping it out. And if I want to wipe it out, I just do another layer. But it does mean, I can soften everything down in the darker areas, and I don't have to worry too much, restraining myself, getting those textures down. So you can see here now I've got to the yellow green. It's a really nice colour, this yellow green. And again, I've just been doing the same marks over and over, just shrinking the area a little bit, so that you can still see the previous paint. Because so that's one thing to be aware of with the Vallejo paints. They are, or tend to, in general, it's not always true, but they tend to have much better opacity than the Games Workshop paints. I don't find them quite as good for glazing, but if you want to make strong, heavy marks, then they're ideal for it. Especially marks like this, say strong, straight lines, very small marks and things like that. Because they are so opaque, they'll leave a line really clearly when you make it, whereas, as I said, it tends to be, but it's not always the case. With Games Workshop paints, if you're trying to paint like a really small, fine mark, it will be more translucent when you make it, and so you probably have to go over that mark 2 or 3 times. Whereas with the Vallejo paint, it's more likely to cover in, 1 or 2 marks. So, just to say, using both brands of paint really can be quite useful. I know a lot of time people say, they just look at the colours and things, but because the paints, they work differently from different brands, even sometimes having the same colour from different brands or similar colour can be really useful. So I'm just going to talk about the volumes of the light that I'm painting on at the moment. Because you can see I keep going over these layers and basically highlighting them, but also, so normally when you see like highlights and things, like if you look at Games Workshop highlights, they tend to just highlight the edges of things. Now obviously I've highlighted the edges of things here, but I'm also highlighting the middle of the the shiny part on his crown thing, and I keep going over and I'm making it lighter and lighter as I go through the different colours on the paint. However, you can't do this as a standard smooth transition, getting to a really small spot in the middle, because that will then make it a smooth transition, and then it won't look quite as shiny. You need the strong contrast between a light and a dark to make something look shiny. So that works really easily for these edges. You can see here, so I've got a light edge that gets really bright next to a dark section, and then instantly looks like shine. For the large flat surface area, you can't do that quite so easily, and what you tend to do, you still need to have a smooth transition so it looks neat. But if you've got a smooth transition going from the dark on one section of that crown going down to a light section, it's going to look really matte. So to counteract that, you need a big block of light next to a block of dark, but then it's not blended. And this is, you have to find out like a way around this. And what you can see here is the block of the highlight that I'm putting that's on the flat surface, it doesn't really shrink that much. It still stays as a large block of light. But obviously I just can't go straight over the top. It's a waste of time. You just be doing layers and layers of paint, adding layers of paint, and you can't see the layers beneath it. And so you might as well have just started off with the brightest colour. However, if you wanted to do, add some kind of subtle translucencies and things, that would be a different thing. But in this case, because I'm working with the volume, I need this large block of highlight. But I am shrinking it very, very slightly at the edges. So every time I add the next highlight, you can still see some of the previous colour around it. So that's kind of like the glow at the very edges of the highlight. And you can see that also on the edge highlight. So at the top of the crown there, where I painted that edge highlight on, you can see as it gets closer to the bottom left edge, it's got lighter. So that's giving you some transition there along the highlight, even though it's still, you can see the strong highlight next to a strong shade. And so what I'm trying to do is do exactly the same thing on the big flat block area as I've done on the edges, just in a larger area. And so by the time I've finished, there'll be a large block of highlight, and then just to the edges of that highlight, it'll then soften very, very quickly towards the dark section, and then that will give the impression that it's a light hitting that area. Because if you go out and you look at something shiny, always look at a reference for these sort of things. But you can see there, a perfect example, on the paintbrush that I'm using, the metal ferrule, you see the highlights on it. There's hardly any transition. I mean, that's obviously nearly a mirror finish, and I'm not looking for a mirror finish, I'm looking for kind of more of a satin look. But on the mirror finish, it's kind of like white, and then whatever it's reflecting around it. Very strong, hard lines between the reflections. Now, if you did that white on reflection on the metal of the ferrule, and you did that as a soft transition going into the darker reflections around it, you will lose that light volume to make it look shiny, and it would then look matte. Because if you look, and then to give an extreme example of something that's matte, say look at the wood on the model holder I've got there, and that's and you can see the metal ring right next to it. Now you can see on the metal it's kind of exactly what I'm talking about. There's the strong highlight, and then it kind of just at the edge of the highlight it softens, and then it goes dark right next to it as it reflects the things around it. So that's the main light from my lamp hitting it, and then the reflections of whatever's in the room, like my fingers or even me reflected in it. Then next to the wood, the light source is exactly the same on the wood, but because the wood is much, much, much more matte, it's just like a very, very soft transition. It goes from light to dark. And obviously because it's so matte, then even the lightest point on the wood isn't bright like the metal. But there are obviously different stages between perfectly polished mirror finish metal and then really dull, flat, kind of like sandpaper or whatever, So there's all these stages, and depending on what finish you want, is very much affected by the volume of the light hitting it. So the shinier something is, the harder the transitions become between the light and the dark. The other thing is that I want the atmosphere on the model to, as I said, to be really kind of moody as well. And to kind of achieve that look, I need everything to be really dark. I just want, he's an evil character basically. Although I'm not sure on the story quite that clearly, but he's an undead, Lord of Death, so he's not going to be kind of a happy-go-lucky with like little rainbows all around him and stuff like that. I really want that kind of dark and moody atmosphere, so I'm going purposely dark. Everything's dark on the model with strong, small highlights just to bring out focal points and to allow me to add colour in those sections. But generally it's going to be quite desaturated overall, desaturated in going down to a dark colour mainly. But then that will allow me every now and then just to add small colours of small spots rather of colour, which will then stand out nicely as well. You can see as I'm applying these colours, I'm not blending them too smoothly. I'm not using any glazing. There will be some glazing later on, but I'm not glazing really the paints. I'm going to be using a contrast paint, and when we get to there, it'll be warp lightning. But I'll explain more about that when we get to it. But the reason I'm not using a lot of glazing to blend these things together is I don't want them to be perfectly smooth. It gets a little bit strange because people say, "Oh, how do you make the blends so smooth on it?" And they really aren't that smooth. If you look at other painting, if you look at painting by people, say like Gareth Nicholas or whatever, that's really smooth glazing with really smooth blending with lots of glazing and things. You really don't see any imperfections in it. The painting that I'm doing here is not smooth. It's purposefully textured, but it's kind of subtle. Subtle and neatly done, so it still looks nice. And there's a difference between having rough painting and having something that's purposefully painted to have texture. Obviously there's the intention there, so if you painted something roughly because you can't do it smoothly, that's because you can't paint smoothly. If you're painting something purposefully to have something textured, then you have to do it well, because if it's done badly, then again you've not achieved the look you're after, and it's purely a case of the result is your lack of ability or knowledge or whatever. I've lost my thread now, but anyway, you can see there I'm painting on all these textures and marks and things. Now they still look subtle at the moment, but it's a bit heavier than I ultimately want them to be. So again, I'm just going to keep going over with these very small marks. You can see I'm just using the tip of the brush, and I'm just doing the same marks over and over again. It's kind of almost like pointillism mixed with dry brushing, and a little bit of blending, all in the same movement. That makes it sound more complicated than it is. It's just being very specific with how you apply the paint. But the paint is kind of like a little bit thicker, maybe. And so I've talked about this in previous videos. What I'm looking for is imperfections in the paint work, and I'm deciding every time I look at them, does it need fixing? Does it look aesthetic or not? It's the aesthetics of what you're doing that is the most important. So if it looks good, basically, then it's fine. If I look at an area and I think it doesn't look that good, then you just work on it a bit more. You can see I'm just painting in the little ring that goes around the spike on his forehead. I wasn't entirely sure what this was supposed to be. Looking at the box art for him, it was painted as a metal spike. I thought maybe it was a gem of some sort, but I decided to go with the metal anyway, just because it's easy to do the non-metallic kind of look to it. And also I can still, even though it's metal, obviously I can still do it quite high contrast and a different colour metal to the green around it, so I can still make it stand out. I mean, I suppose if I wanted, I could have painted it as like a red gem. Now, red would contrast obviously with the green. However, I am really not keen on using red and green combinations because it has very strong links to Christmas. Every time someone paints something that's red and green, it just looks Christmassy to me. So I try and steer away from that. And it is something always to bear in mind. Just because something contrasts on the colour wheel doesn't mean that those contrasts don't have other meanings. So sometimes like the colours might work together, but there are other social influences involved in those colour combinations. And obviously, if you want those influences to be, shown on the artwork or not, will be whether you actually use those combinations. You can see here I'm picking out the edges a little bit more strongly than the metal around them. Again, I feel like I say this nearly every video. Hard edges catch the light more than flat surfaces, because the light is kind of focused on a small area, and also from an aesthetic perspective, it looks, it just makes things stand out by catching some of the edges. Now, if you want to go full edge highlighting, more towards Games Workshop heavy metal style painting, that's fine as well. However, I do find that if you do everything with the same weight of highlight on the edges, it kind of flattens everything. Whereas if you just pick out some edges and make certain edges lighter, as if they're catching more light, so upper edges or edges closer to the light source or facing the light source are lighter than the edges that would face downwards or whatever, it creates a stronger three-dimensional look. Kind of adds a bit more realism while still allowing you to define shapes and things with those edges. Now, I said earlier on that I'm using a top left light source, which means that everything basically to the right on the crown and the top of the hat is in shadow. Now, in normal lighting situations, you don't just have one light source hitting an object and that's it. You're always going to get reflected light. So you'll get light reflecting off like walls around you, off the floor. There could be multiple light sources even. So the sun, if you're outside, usually the sun will be the primary light source, but obviously the sun's reflecting off things. If you're standing next to a car, then you're going to get light bouncing right off the side of the car and things. This is why when you see people, they're not always like heavily in shadow, when out in the daylight, they're it's not like they're half in shadow, half in light. You see a lot of their face quite clearly, and there's just like subtle shadows and things. And even in those shadows, you can still see the light. So you have to do the same thing while you're painting. Now, sometimes it can be kind of interesting to have really strong dramatic light just coming from one direction, and then you won't have any on the other side. Or you can use kind of tricks where you have like the strong dramatic lighting on one side, then you have a nice coloured light on the other. You get this a lot really with people painting busts. You see it all the time. People love to have like the strong dramatic light from one side and then a different coloured light to add atmosphere, especially like reds and blues coming from the other side. But despite all that waffle, what I'm saying is, so I've got like the primary light source coming from the top left. I still have to paint the right hand side of the hood and things. But because the primary light source is to the left, that needs to be the stronger focal point. And then to the right side, it's going to be much more dulled down. One of the hardest things that I'm going to have to face while I'm painting this model as a whole piece is not to over highlight things, because it's very easy to focus really hard on what you're painting, like the small area that you're working on, and then highlight it and shade it without taking into account the overall look of the model. If you're painting heavy metal style, that's not such a problem, because that's more their look, is that everything is painted with a kind of a similar sort of weight due to the edge highlights and things. They still have a limited amount of focal point with their lighting and things, and it has come more and more into their style of painting over the years. Like previously it was nearly all edge highlighting, but as it's gone along they've kind of added more, kind of subtle textures and lighting and things. But if you look at other styles of painting, if you look at sort of things painted, say from Monte Sansovino or whatever, other famous painting competitions, you'll see that they go for much more realistic style lighting, and on those kind of models, you're painting in all the shadows and things. Sometimes they don't bother so much about painting in the shadows. It just really depends what the artists are going for and things like that. It gets it gets complicated. But if you are painting like an overly lit model where it's lit all over, but you still want the strong highlights, you do have to paint things neatly on the sides that aren't painted, aren't lit, but you still have to paint them in, but in a much more subtle way, subtle and neatly, and that's the key thing. So I'm kind of like crossing the streams, to have a Ghostbusters reference. I'm trying to do models that I can paint for a golden demon, which have all the kind of the neatness, so you're still painting things in the shadows, and trying to make sure everything's picked out and given equal amount of attention, but also have it in a kind of a subtle, slightly more realistic style of painting. So I have the strong light sources and things like that. So we're going to see how I do, if I manage to achieve it or not by the end of this project anyway. You can see here how I'm applying the paint. I'm kind of almost like, it looks like I'm wiggling it on there. It's more controlled than it might look, and I'm always paying attention to the marks that the paintbrush is making. So sometimes I'm wiggling it just to see what marks appear, but then as they appear, I'm still adjusting as the paint goes along. And then obviously going over it and refining and things as I go along. And so basically what I'm doing is I'm again adding sort of a very, very slight texture to the piece. The crown itself is going to be slightly different to the all the bones and things. So I'm painting all the bones on the model as non-metallic green. Well, it's non-metallic gold with a green kind of tone stuck on top. And again, that's for the atmosphere. So I will be adding some of that green throughout the model, but I don't want the model to just be green. And I mean, you'll see as it goes along, I'm going to be adding other colours and things, but I really want to keep that kind of undead atmosphere. I think the green lights really strongly kind of emphasise the undead nature, mainly because that's been used so commonly in artwork. Not just Games Workshop, but anyway, green kind of ghostly light is very commonly used in all sorts of media for representing undead. I guess it shows sort of like that sickly yellow greeny. It's like an unhealthy colour. So you can see here I'm painting on the inside of the curve on the crown section. It's important that you don't forget these parts, especially for Golden Demon entry type models, because again they will be picked out if you miss them. It's very easy to miss them because once you've painted all the edges and things on the front of the model, and you look at it and you think that looks done, but of course it isn't, because you can see if you look closely on the model, you can see that there's kind of like an empty dark gap between the edge of the crown and that, as it goes back and touches the hat part. So anyway, I've skipped a little bit ahead here, and you can see I've started working on the non-metallic bony bits on the top of the hat, and I've also painted in quickly the shiny metal stud on the forehead of the crown. But before I start waffling on about those, I'm going to be painting the purple section. Now, for anyone that's seen the latest update of this image, or this model rather, you probably have noticed that the section doesn't look purple at all. So some of it still shows through a little bit, and by the time I finish this purple section, you're going to see that it's you can definitely see some of the work still showing through, but I have obviously put freehand over this area and put kind of like a green tone on it. But basically what I'm trying to say is, so although you're going to see me painting this purple section and see how I work it in, get some textures and things like that, a lot of that will be hidden underneath the freehand and the glazing that I put on top of it. That's not to say that it's not worth doing this stage. Just be aware that you might feel as you're painting it that you're wasting your time, but all these subtle marks do add up, and once you see the finished piece, it is kind of worth it. So I'm starting off with Naggaroth Knight, and I'm just blocking in the area. So even though I'm just using one colour, I am building up the layer so that the light source is still consistent with the light on the non-metallic gold area. So the purple is going to be more opaque as it gets down to the bottom in this kind of little recessed area, and it it fades out as it goes up. Also, I'm not going for a completely opaque purple all over, and there are going to be highlight colours added. You can see what you saw, the paints I was using, and what I have done is just kind of mixed some of the colours that I've used from the non-metallic green gold into the purple, and this is to try and get kind of like the greeny sort of look. It doesn't really give a greeny look because you're mixing paint and light work differently with mixing, but it's desaturating the purple and it's giving it that kind of still ill looking feel, because I know that I'm adding the green glazing afterwards with the warp lightning. I'm not too bothered about getting everything perfectly lined up in terms of colours at the moment, but it does help a little bit with just to keep the same colours used in various parts on the model. So there's going to be warp lighting used all over the model, obviously, but just even using some of the other colours. So things like the yellow green will appear in other parts of the model, even sometimes where you probably won't expect it. And so you can see there I've got this horrible mix of colours on the on my wet palette there. So we've got the Naggaroth Knight, then I've added a small amount of the yellow green, then I added a bit more yellow green, and then I added some of the ivory to the last one. The exact amounts don't matter, again it's just a case of getting these tonal jumps, so you can see it goes from light to dark from left to right on the wet palette. And I'm talking about the 4 colours, one up from the bottom. I also mixed Naggaroth Night along with some black for the bottom right there. I don't actually really need that too much. I mean, I will blend it in, but because of the amount of layers and things that I'm going to be adding on top of all this work, any kind of really subtle shading like that isn't really that necessary. But yeah, we're going to see how it turns out. So here you can see it's not very clear on the wet palette, to be honest, but it is a highlight colour, so it has had the yellow green added to the purple. So I can use this as straight up, because it's a lighter colour, I can use it as a highlight straight away. So even though it looks just like a dirty mess on the wet palette, you can see when it's added to the model, it does stand out. And basically it's just desaturating the purple a little bit with a lighter colour. I particularly picked out the edges again. You can see down the middle of the hat there's that strong line right down the centre. But also I was talking about this little recess area right next to the crown. The lighting there has to match the intensity of the lighting on the crown itself. And then as I go up it can fade out more. It's not necessarily super realistic having it fade out quite as much, because obviously I'm going to be adding highlights to the bone non-metallic gold sections above, but I've made those a little bit shinier, so it makes more sense that they'd catch the light better anyway. And the purple hat part is more matte, so it doesn't have to catch have such a strong light reflection on it. But here you can see as I'm adding the highlights on top, it's just making the purple more desaturated and ill-diseased, just dirty looking, but you can still see the purple showing through. And again, as you see, it looks like a sort of horrible dirty browny, really purpley kind of mess on the wet palette, but it's working exactly as I want as I apply it to the model. It looks like it's obviously matching the tones on the crown, because I'm using the same colours, I mean, or at least one of them. So there's yellow green on the purple of the hat, and there's yellow green in the green of the crown, and so they match because it's the same colour. So even though it looks, kind of, I keep saying this horrible colour on the palette, it is working as intended. Now for the final one, where I've mixed in a little bit of the ivory. Now obviously there's ivory on the crown as well. You have to be a bit careful with the ivory. It's really desaturated by this point, and it's super bright. Obviously I'm going to go over it with the green as well, but it's really strong at this point. So you can see here on the hat as well, at the top of the hat, it's really picking out these edges, which is fine. You're picking out the details, but the stronger the higher the contrast on an area, the more it draws the eye. And so every time you're doing that, you're pulling your eye away from looking at the face. I mean, fortunately, the face is still quite bright. Well, I keep saying the face. I haven't painted the face yet. I mean the crown, kind of the general head area. But it's still, it still makes you fight for your attention, having these strong contrast areas. You can see as I'm applying this, I'm doing, again, that sort of very similar brush mark to how I applied the paint on the crown. So I'm kind of getting a sort of a rough bit of texture in there. Sometimes I hope the judges kind of understand really when I'm painting this. I am purposely adding texture. I'm not always sure that people realise that I'm purposefully doing the painting like this. I don't want like a perfectly smooth finish to it. I like having a bit of texture in there. You can see as well, so when I was saying I was adding the Naggaroth Knight, and I wasn't getting like a perfectly big finish. Again, there was like little blemishes in there where some of the black primer is showing through. Then I can pick these sections out now and use the highlight colours. I wouldn't use the Naggaroth Knight yellow, green and ivory mix, the one on the far left, that is really bright, so that'll be too high a contrast really. I mean, you could pick out the odd one, the big ones that you want, but really I just stick to the the pure yellow, green and Naggaroth Knight mix. It's around about 50-50. Obviously the one next to that, the Naggaroth Knight and yellow, green, to the right, it's kind of 2-to-1 Naggaroth Knight and yellow, green. But again, don't take my word for it for the exact mixes. Just make sure that you have those different steps in the tonal range. That's all you're looking for really with this, because a lot of the colour work can be fixed afterwards with glazes and things. So I said earlier on that I wasn't too bothered about the Naggaroth Knight mixed with Abaddon Black. You see in the bottom right there. But I am using it again just to soften in some of these textures. I know they look very subtle in the video, but again I just wanted to dull them down even more. And now what I'm doing here, you can see, is I'm just adding a little bit of light, because obviously this hat, it has a very subtle curve on it. So I'm just picking that out ever so slightly. Unfortunately, when I had the freehand over the top, it hides that a little bit, but again, it's just adding. It is still there if you look carefully. So, as I said, you're wiping away a lot of the work that you're doing, but it still is there if you look carefully, which, again, they're all nice little details that you can see that hopefully make a difference when it comes to judging time. So you can really see there now how it looks kind of, textured, but not super heavily textured. I'm really trying to work with the translucency of the paint there, so that even though obviously that mix with the ivory in it is really strong, I'm trying to get like a thin layer down, so that it's not too strong basically. I just keep going backwards and forwards using these paints, blending them in softly at the side. So obviously I was talking earlier on about the different reflective surfaces and how the metal, say like on the model holder, is much brighter than the wood because it's a shinier surface. So it's exactly the same with the hat here. The hat has much softer transitions going into the highlights, so that kind of contrasts against the shininess of the metal next to it. You can see that the volumes, it's there's no real strong block of highlight at any point. They're all soft going into the next one. Although the line down the middle of the hat still is a hard line there, because obviously it's a hard line on the model, so it will, even though it's not a reflective surface, it's reflective, but it's a very kind of matte surface still, the hard curve will still catch more light than the rest of the softer surfaces on the hat itself. You can also see I've been working obviously to the left of the hat, and the right hasn't really got that much paint on it at all. It's mostly just purple. That is going to stay very similar to that. There's going to be a small amount of work on this side, but I'm not going to go anywhere near as bright on that side as on the left hand side. So again, it matches the highlight on the crown. You have to keep your light consistent throughout the model, or it's just going to look weird. And that's one of the drawbacks for painting in this style of paint, because you have to keep it consistent throughout the whole model, and faults will really stand out when you get the lighting wrong. Whereas if you're not using lighting, then you can't go wrong with it. You can see a little bit on the paint as well for these three mixes where I've been blending the hat colours. The paint is a tiny little bit thicker than the other paints that I've been using, and that just allows me to get this textured look a lot easier. The thinner the paint, so the more water that you add to it, the harder it is to get these textures, because the edges aren't defined when you make the marks, and they become, more translucent, and you just end up making a really soft transition. But anyway, that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. There'll be more very soon. Thank you much for watching, and I'll see you next time.